in the military. You are one of the only voices for peace. However, since we began discussing this issue months ago, I noticed that there are grassroots peace movements springing up around the world, not only in Germany, which you rarely see. Reuters won't cover it very much. Here in America, we have peace marches that the mainstream media will not cover. It's like Vietnam all over again, only in reverse, where conservatives are the peaceniks and the liberals are the warmongers. It's crazy.
Well, I'm not sure that conservative and liberal mean as much as they once did. Too many of the so-called conservatives strike me as being closet liberals anyway.
We don't know what they are. We have no idea who they're just, let's just say, naked Machiavellian, self-interested people without any thought about what might happen if the war keeps getting bigger. 1 year of war in Ukraine marked last week. Biden makes a surprise visit to Kiev. Putin addresses his own people. Why has Biden been turned from sort of a moderate in a way a few months ago to almost a full-scale warmonger? What's going on, Colonel?
Well, you're asking me a tough question. I'm not a political expert. All I know is that increasingly I view him as a cardboard cutout president who essentially reads whatever is put in front of him and signs whatever is put in front of him.
But I think, yeah.
I don't think he's really in charge, and you're absolutely right. If you go back and look at Biden in the 90s or even in the early part of this century, he was a much more reasonable and moderate person who certainly was not in favor of interventionism and wars that were unnecessary. So I just don't pay too much attention to him, but I listen to what he says because that's what his donors, backers, sponsors, whatever you want to call them, want.
So who's behind them? The military-industrial complex, so-called?
No, I'm sure that's part of it, but there are lots of different groups of people that have an interest in prosecuting this war. The only thing I can say with absolute certainty is that Americans are not interested in going to war with Russia. Most Americans don't know anything about Russia. They don't know much about Ukraine. They don't understand how this came about. And frankly, most of them, as you know, Doctor, aren't interested. I mean, that's the biggest problem we have.
You know, interesting, Colonel, you say most of them. I agree with you with my intuitive sense of what America feels, which I've developed over many years of working as a talk show host. But there have been no real polls. And when they are out, it's like 47% are opposed to the war. How do we know how many people really want war in this country?
Well, you're right. Polls are very deceptive. And it depends on the question that's asked and how it's asked.
Yes.
But you know, frankly speaking, I was out in the western part of this state, and people said, really, I'm not paying attention to it. You know, I got more problems. I got my own problems.
Americans, they have their own domestic issues, inflation.
Yeah. And then I run into a few that have a son somewhere who's in the Army or the Marines or the Navy or the Air Force, and they'll say, well, you know, I don't know what they want to fight these people for. I don't know what it's about. I hope my son doesn't get involved.
Yeah,
I hear that a lot.
You know, this past week, Colonel, we saw China come up with a peace plan. I thought it was very reasonable, of course. Not of course. I did think it was very reasonable and, of course, it was reasonable. Immediately rejected by that creepy Jake Sullivan and the establishment media, literally before the words left the Chinese diplomat's mouth. Called for a ceasefire in place, peace talks as soon as possible, not to threaten using nuclear weapons. I read it very carefully. Immediately, the EU warmongers rejected this peace plan, saying that China had already supported Moscow in the war.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
Why has China entered in at this point in a more dramatic way? Why do you think they understand they have to take a side sort of with not neutrality? It's sort of on the side of Russia, isn't it?
Well, you've hit an enormous nail on the head. This is a hugely important issue. The biggest mistake we could possibly make was to dismiss a proposal by the Chinese out of hand. Right. This is the largest country in the world. And, you know, their industrial base today that is capable of producing ammunition, missiles, rockets, and so forth is twice the size of what ours was during the height of the Second World War.
Wait, let's pause on that. That's very important. China has a native ability to produce twice and is producing twice the amount of the weaponry,
Well, they're not producing it at the moment, but they have the capacity to do it.
To produce twice the amount of weaponry we produced at the height of World War II?
Yes.
You're kidding. With General Motors, General Dynamics, U.S. Steel?
Yes. This is what people don't seem to understand. And thus far, contrary to popular belief, the Chinese have not provided material support to Russia.
Have not.
No. What the Chinese have said repeatedly to the Russians is, we understand your position.
Mm-hmm.
And we understand what you're trying to do, but we would like you to do this quickly and find a way to end it quickly. And that makes perfect sense if you're Chinese, because your preeminent goal is to build the rail lines between China and Europe for this One Belt, One Road program.
Mm.
Most of that rail has to go straight through Ukraine.
Oh, my God.
Northern Russia and White Russia,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where you've got to go to reach the terminals in Europe. So that's what they want to do. And the Russians had signed on with the Chinese years ago to help them by helping them to stabilize Central Asia. Mm. If you go to the various stands, as people call them, the people that rule those countries, the governments, are much more
stands, as Uzbekistan, etc.
Yes, Kazakhstan and Turkestan and so forth. They're much more comfortable with the Russians than they are with the Chinese. They don't trust the Chinese. They don't like the Chinese, but they're willing to cooperate. And the Russians have essentially backed them, provided them with support when they needed it. And the Chinese have been very grateful for that stability, because you can't do business in a crisis, in a chaotic, war-torn area. So the Chinese were never happy about what was happening in Ukraine, but they understood it. And there's something else here. If you go to Latin America right now, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, everyone is looking at what's happening in Europe, in Eastern Europe. Most are shocked, but on the whole, most of the people watching are sympathetic to Russia's position. And that's largely because they see Russia as confronting the United States and its European allies. And they know that the Russians have a legitimate security concern, but they too want this to be over. And they're watching carefully to see what the Russians do. The Russians could, and this is something that we don't talk about very much, they have rocket artillery batteries with thermobaric warheads. This is fuel-air explosive. These are huge warheads that they can launch. A thermobaric warhead effectively detonates, and let us say for a mile in every direction, all of the oxygen is sucked out of the area and used to detonate this vapor that effectively annihilates everything within a mile and burns it to a crisp.
Wait, it sounds like a neutron bomb in a way.
Well, it is, except it does enormous damage. The neutron bomb was designed to kill life, but nothing else.
Yes, the Pope called it very humane.
The Russians have been very, yeah, but the Russians have been very economical with the use of this, because they don't want to kill civilians. They know that there are large numbers of people living in these towns and cities in the Donbass, and they're also aware that they have an audience. They're not worried about what you and I think. They don't care what Washington says. They no longer care what the Europeans think, but they do care what the Chinese think, the Japanese, the Southeast Asians, the Indians, the Arabs, the Africans, and Latin Americans, because they know they need to do business with them, and they can't build an alternative monetary system. In other words, they can't de-dollarize and get out from under our monetary system, out from under our financial system, without all of these others participating. So they're very sensitive to what people say.
When you say they, who are the theys?
The Russians.
Got it. So
the people in Moscow, and I'll tell you, it's not necessarily the population. The population is just furious. They want Ukrainians to be ground into dust.
The Russian people want it over with through massive warfare, old style, pulverize them.
Yes. And Putin has said no, he's not going to do that, which is why it takes longer. It's why they're systematically clearing towns and cities. I mean, Putin actually made a speech. It was not broadcast in the West, but he said, look, there are people that have lived in some of these homes, their families, for 200 years. If you destroy the house, where do they go? Where do they live? He's made it very clear that he's not insensitive to this. All this nonsense about Russian barbarism, all these things they're being accused of that are lifted from history books from World War II about the Soviets, none of that applies. So this helps to explain, some of the slowness. Now that we have offended the Chinese, we've snubbed their peace proposal, the Chinese are going to provide some material help to the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to come in the form of large quantities, millions of rounds of artillery that they no longer need, that are sitting in warehouses.
Wait, that the Chinese no longer need?
Yes.
What do you mean? They're old munitions?
Yes. These are older munitions.
Use them up.
Yeah. And they'll load the rail cars. And I was talking to a Russian just the other day, and he explained to me that each rail car carries 60 tons.
Oh, God.
And so you're talking about a train of 100 cars. Each one's loaded down with 100 tons of hard shell artillery ammunition. And for that matter, they can also load up rockets and missiles.
Oh, my God.
Because they largely use similar systems. They have upgraded their 152 millimeter artillery system to 155. But that means that they can give the Russians all the 152 millimeter ammunition, which is what the Russians use.
So the Chinese want to get rid of the old ammo. God.
Yes. So I think that's going to happen now.
Oh, my God.
And we were very stupid. We should have welcomed their interest and concern because it was genuine. Yes, the Chinese are not unsympathetic to the Russians, but they have no interest in drawing out this conflict. It looks more and more as though the only people that want to drag this out and prolong it are sitting in Washington, D.C.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's an awful lot to digest. Immediately after the Chinese made that peace proposal, Secretary of Hate, Anthony Blinken, the powerful Zeus-like figure, Blinken, came out and said terrible things would be a serious problem. Senator Lindsey Graham, who grew up in a house of ill repute above a gambling hall in a bar, said it would be the most catastrophic thing that could happen to the U.S.-China relationship. That would change everything forever. So he's obviously, Lindsey Graham, to me, is one of the worst kinds. And then, of course, we had the Republican delegation with these characters going over there, so-called Republicans, McCall and others, pushing more. We'll give you as much as you need forever, they said to the comedian. Can we chip in and buy him a suit, by the way, for the next appearance? Must we continue?
I'm not contributing. I think he should go back to pennies or something and get more.
I don't understand why he thinks appearing in a green undershirt is appealing to the world, but it's working.
The Savage Nation. It's Savage on demand.
By the way, Colonel, I have to step off the stage of seriousness for a second. He's got a good racket going. Whatever he asks for, it's not enough. So you give me nuclear weapons. Not good. We want hydrogen bomb. Yeah. Give hydrogen bomb. We want B-52 now. This guy knows the game. Always say it's not enough. Always make everyone feel bad. But they're not reacting to that. They're not reacting to guilt. There's another reason for it. And what is that reason? Is what? Simply economic reasons? Military industrial I don't believe it can only be that.
Well, isn't this a good case of wag the dog?
I think it's the domino theory. It's the repetitive Vietnam era domino theory that if we let Russia take Ukraine, they're going to take Poland and the Baltic states. Yeah, isn't that the domino theory all over again?
Yeah, well, that's part of the rationale for this, which makes no sense because there's no evidence for it. I mean, Professor Mearsheimer has made that comment over and over and over again. He said this is all evidence-free analysis. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Russians are interested in conquering Eastern Europe. That's a lot of nonsense. They certainly don't want to rule non-Russians. They've had their noses full of that for years. They look back on that as having been a disaster privately, economically for Russia. So no, they're not interested in that. But I think the problem we have right now is that we dug this hole very deep. Mm-hmm. And we don't know how to get out of it, and so we're going to continue to dig.
Well, it's like Russia dug its hole. We've dug our hole with the proxy war of Ukraine. Zelensky is a man who makes Napoleon look like a moderate in terms of his egomania and madness. I've never seen anyone with a worse Napoleonic complex from a psychological point of view than this man.
Well, if you're a weak state and you are fighting a larger state than yours, and you think that you're in a fight for your life, and that apparently is the case for Mr. Zelensky and his government, then you will do anything in your power to involve other great powers in your war in the hopes that they will come in and win it for you.
Oh, sure. You always want a bigger guy to protect you in a fight.
Yeah. So thus far, he's been successful, at least in terms of equipment. And look, we don't know how many thousands of non-Ukrainians in Ukrainian uniform there are. We think there are certainly 20,000 Poles serving in Ukrainian uniform.
Really?
Yes, and we can hear them on the radios. The Russians report it all the time, and they're very good soldiers. There's a cemetery in Poland that supposedly contains 2,000 to 2,500 dead Polish soldiers that were killed in the war. Then you have thousands of other foreigners. We don't know how many thousands of Americans operating as contractors.
That's what I want to know. How many U.S. Special Forces are actually on the ground in your estimation?
I don't know. I can't. You'd have to ask somebody with a lot of experience in Special Forces, but let's be frank. They've been there from the beginning, and there are a lot of them.
They're like the advisors in Vietnam in the beginning again.
Well, it's more than that now, because when you get up above the tactical level, you find that staffs are manned in many cases by NATO officers. You have NATO officers at the highest levels as well as at the intermediate level, the operational level, helping to plan operations. Remember, we have cells of 50 and 60 analysts in various places that are providing intelligence information to the Ukrainians that come from our space-based systems. That's why the Ukrainians occasionally have some success, because the space-based surveillance tells them, oh, look, the Russians don't have anybody at this point attack here, and they occasionally have some success before they're driven back.
Unbelievable.
So this has been going on for quite some time, and, Putin in his speech made it very clear that these people are not going to be treated as foreign soldiers. They're going to be treated as mercenaries that are not protected under the Geneva Convention. So once this offensive, which has begun, grinds further north and further west as they overcome Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian defenses, we're going to see a lot of people get out of the way or face death.
Colonel, a few questions pop up as you speak. Many questions arise. We're going to talk, if we can, in a moment about President Lukashenko of Belarus.
Right.
Belarus is a strong ally of Russia, correct?
Yes.
China announced the visit of President Lukashenko of Belarus to China. What does that indicate?
Well, there are only 8 million people living in Belarus. In other words, white Russia, only 8 million people. And I'm sure that he's interested in whatever foreign aid can be provided that can help him build up his country.
When you say only 8 million, you mean that sarcastically, right?
Yeah, I'm serious. Only 8 million people. And we tend to look at white Russia and we think, oh, well, that must have 40 or 50 million people in it. Just as Ukraine once had 37.4 million, now it's down to about 18 to 22 million. So the point is that these are not large countries per se, and they have an interest in plugging into China because they know they cannot turn to the West. We've treated Lukashenko as a pariah. We tried to stage a color revolution against him.
We tried to do the same thing there that we did in Ukraine?
Yes.
Oh.
But it failed.
And wait, that was the same McCain and Newland?
I don't know that McCain was still alive at that point. But it's, the same cast of actors in Washington, obviously. All we did was succeed in driving white Russia into Russia's arms.
Oh, boy. Something odd happened this week. Mr. Zelensky on Sunday fired his number one commander. What happened, do you think?
Well, it's all speculative. None of us know with precision what happened. He'd been in command, I think, since August. There are any number of reasons that you remove somebody like that. It could be that he told Zelensky the hard facts about the Donetsk Basin, the Donbass, because this is effectively what Ukrainians have fought hardest to keep, because it's the area with the greatest potential economically. And the loss of the Donbass is an absolute fact at this point. They can't retain it. They've taken terrible casualties, and he may have told Zelensky that, and that may have said, well, then you're fired. You failed.
Well, they made it. The cover story was over corruption.
Yeah, well, then you've got to get rid of the whole government. Come on. That place wallows in corruption.
In your recent interviews, you said things such as the Ukrainians are staring down the barrel of a very big gun.
Yes.
Ukraine is about to be annihilated.
The Ukrainian army, definitely.
So
I think the Ukrainian state is in ruins. I don't know that Ukraine will ever recover from this war, Doctor.
Ever recover?
Yeah, I mean, how can they? Most of these people, the 10 plus million that have left the country, when they've been interviewed in Europe, and remember, 2 million of them went to Russia because they were Russians. Another 8 to 9 million are Ukrainians. They went west, and when you ask them, "Are you going back when the war is over?" and they universally say no.
Why would they? They have it
I'll
so
never
good
go
now
back.
in Western nations. Many of them are educated, speak English. They're hardworking. They're not leeches. They contribute to society, and they make for good citizens. Of course, they could always go to Mexico and import a few million people from Guatemala or Mexico into Ukraine to rebuild it. That's a joke, a terrible joke.
Yeah, bad one. Yeah.
A very bad joke. But we don't know where are they going to conscript people to work in Ukraine? From Africa, the way they're doing in Germany?
I have no idea.
No
I don't know what the Germans are thinking, because they certainly don't need that.
Yeah, what are they thinking? I can tell you what they're thinking. I can make a wild guess of why the psychopathic socialists who run Germany are bringing in Africans from Africa into Germany when they don't need the workers. And that is to counteract the white male in Germany who they fear will become a force that they want to destroy.
Yeah,
it's awful. It's racism of the worst kind.
The Savage Nation. It's savage, uncut, unfiltered, and raw.
I know you don't want to get dragged into my particular, quote, paranoid view of the world, but I'll tell you, the longer I look at this, the worse it gets, the uglier it gets. And, I said something the other day on one of my little podcasts somewhere, or my YouTube pieces. I said, we were told that when women gained power, there would be more peace in the world. And I said, well, take a look at Europe and Scandinavia. Look at Scandinavia. Was once basically a blessed place on earth, highly neutral since World War II by and large. And now they become gung-ho, bloodthirsty, militant under millennial women who are running these countries.
Well, it's been 80 years since the Second World War ended. They haven't seen or witnessed a real war in that time frame. So there are lots of people in Europe and in North America, Doctor, who've lost their healthy fear of war.
Fear of war.
I mean, everyone should be afraid of war.
Yes.
The problem is that...
that's a great statement. That's a hell of a title. Everyone should be afraid of war.
Absolutely. But the problem is that we haven't fought real wars in that sense. What we fought over the last 30 years are a series of what I would call colonial brushfire wars. We faced very weak opponents in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. We've dominated them with firepower. They have no organization. That is, they don't have real armies, real air forces, let alone real navies. And we've patted ourselves on the back and congratulated ourselves as great warriors and victors in battle. When in truth, we did essentially what the British did at a place like Omdurman in 1999, and Churchill's little cavalry charge. You were facing large numbers of tribal fighters who had no chance whatsoever against machine guns and rapid fire artillery.
In Africa?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what people lose sight of. And so we wrongly concluded, well, war is something that happens in someone else's country. War never happens here. It happens overseas. And we never take heavy casualties. We take very few casualties. And that's because we're the best. Well, put that all together and you are deluded on an Olympic level.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have no idea what we're dealing with in Ukraine. And Russia, when it went in at first, because it went in a very sort of restrained and tempered manner, because Putin still thought Ukrainians, well, they're brother Slavs. We don't want to do damage to them. And we want to end this quickly. We just want to come to a settlement over neutrality for Ukraine and autonomy for the two republics and recognizing the legitimacy of Crimea. And suddenly he wakes up halfway through this thing in the summer and says, my God, I'm at war with the United States and the whole NATO alliance.
He made a big mistake, didn't he? He also made a mistake.
Yes. So now what's he done? Well, what would you do? You'd get ready to fight a real war.
Well, this is a great junction. Would he get ready to fight this inevitable great war and unleash his real might? Or will he seek to back out and save face?
No. He sees this, and his countrymen see this as a direct challenge to their existence. The only alternative that we've provided to them is, well, we'll be happy to make peace with you as soon as this man Putin is removed, the government is replaced, and we dismember Russia. That's
what's this with Zelensky? What's with Zelensky making foolish statements such as "our tanks will be in Red Square"? That is one of
there you go.
That's one of the
and they're going to have iron crosses painted on them. Imagine how the Russians feel about that.
That's what I'm saying. They remember the Nazi armies invading Russia. How could Zelensky make a statement like that is so utterly provocative and stupid is what I want to know.
Well, he's irresponsible, but then again, so are the people in Washington. Listen to them. Lindsey Graham stands out there and says, well, somebody needs to take this man Putin out. Somebody needs to take him out. Oh, my God. Now we're going to advocate for the assassination of world leaders.
A few months ago, we all agreed that would be a horrendous thing to even say.
It's outrageous nonsense. Eisenhower would have locked him up for it.
It is sort of seditious to provoke a world leader like that. So where does that leave us? I mean, everyone should be afraid of war. Those of us who were at least punched in the nose once in our life know what war is, just from a punch in the nose. When you get a blackout from a good punch in the nose.
Sure.
But, most people live in a bubble. They're on medication. They don't even know the world they are living in or what it is. So when the enemy comes to their gates, in America, the liberal embraces the enemy and wants to understand the enemy. They don't even, they want to embrace the one who breaks through their front door. I see it over and over again.
Yeah.
Crazy country we're living in. And none of it makes sense to me anymore. And I don't know how this ends, Colonel. I honestly don't know where this goes. I mean, nobody can predict where this is going to go. Can we?
Oh, I think it's dangerous to make too many predictions, but it's very clear that if you're sitting in Moscow, you realize that you only have one path forward, and that is to complete the destruction of the Ukrainian army.
Oof.
That has to happen. Now, once that's done, there may be a chance for some sort of settlement. The only other thing that I think Moscow looks for is a potential change in some of the governments in Europe. Now, I know that the foreign minister of Germany is probably on the glide path to elimination from the government. She's not likely to last too much longer. She's made all sorts of stupid statements along the lines of, we, as part of Europe, are at war with Russia.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't go down well in Germany because no one remembers voting for war with Russia. And now Scholz, he's trying to recover from all of this, but doesn't seem to have the guts to get rid of her and make a U-turn.
You made a great point on the last podcast with me, since corroborated by an awful lot of people. Zelensky is a native Russian speaker who did not even speak Ukrainian. He had to learn Ukrainian.
That's right.
That's an odd thing to learn, that he came from an area of Ukraine where Russian was a native language, and that he himself, as I said yesterday during a YouTube piece, speaks Ukrainian as a second language.
Well, a Ukrainian told me the other day that it's very easy to pick it out. Apparently, this town of Bakhmut that we've heard so much about,
yes,
center of fighting. Well, in Russian, you say Bakhmut. But in Ukrainian, for instance, you say Bakhmut. And he said he fumbles all the time. Whenever he mentions Bakhmut, he says Bakhmut instead of Bakhmut. So people are actually reminded that the man really isn't a native Ukrainian speaker at all. And that's, we dismiss these things in the United States, these minor intonations,
yes,
these inflections. But in Europe, these are very meaningful things.
Absolutely. Wars have been fought over a difference in dialect. So borders, language, culture, apparently Joe Biden will give them all they need for as long as they need to protect their borders, language, and culture in Ukraine, while our southern border is a sieve. Do I have to mention the drugs, the millions of people pouring over our border like invading cells? I know I'm not supposed to make that point, but I do. I couldn't believe the other day, Janet Yellen, the Yenta from Brooklyn, gets up and repeats the same thing. We'll give them all the money they need for as long as it takes, whatever it takes. Every one of them had the same message. We support Ukraine with whatever they need for as long as they need it. Aren't we running low on ammunition?
Well, our stocks are very low. We've done this to ourselves, obviously, and we have been asking allies to pitch in. I mean, one of the reasons that Biden went to visit Kyiv and then also Warsaw was that he's trying to bolster support in Europe inside the NATO alliance for what we're doing in Ukraine. Behind the scenes, NATO is not some sort of unified juggernaut. That's a lot of nonsense. NATO is falling apart. More and more Europeans are saying, we didn't sign up for this. We don't want it. We don't want to mobilize and go to war against Russia. And they don't see any need to do so.
Well, I see peace movement. I see peace protests or anti-war protests occurring throughout Europe and America. Again, grassroots, very much like the Vietnam era here in America, and again suppressed by the mainstream media. I don't know what the support is for war within NATO. Do we have any idea?
I can tell you that once you get below the political level and you start pressing hard for information, there is by no means unanimity of opinion regarding what is happening in Eastern Europe.
Okay.
I think French general officers are more divided than others. The German generals are quiet for fear that they will be accused of being politicized and closet Nazis or something.
Of course.
So they're afraid to say anything. The people, I always found it interesting when I was serving in SHAPE, the people most anxious to bomb the Serbs and start a war in the Balkans were the people who lived up in Norway.
Why?
The further away you got from the theater of war, the more anxious the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the Norwegians were to wage war. As soon as you got on the continent and started moving in the direction of where the war zone was, you didn't find much support. The Italians, the Greeks, the Germans, the Austrians, very, very uncomfortable with the whole thing. So I think you have something like that happening right now. And remember, nobody was consulted on any of this. And they're very, very worried. I'm sure you were aware that quite recently, the Ukrainians, I say the Ukrainians, or someone in the Ukrainian military, succeeded in attacking the Russian equivalent of an AWACS aircraft, airborne warning and control system, up in White Russia, in Belarusia. And people said, oh, no, now we're going to get a war with White Russia as well as Russia, and all hell's going to break loose. In reality, nothing like that happened, because both Lukashenko and Putin do not want to expand this war. They want to contain it because they want to bring it to an end. We're the ones who keep trying to spread the wealth, so to say, and expand this conflict, which, of course, is dangerous and disastrous.
Home of borders, language, culture, the Savage Nation.
Since China made this move for peace, do you think there's been a change under the surface towards peace?
Here in the United States?
No. I noticed even Zelensky shut his mouth for a few hours.
Even the Polish president said this is something we should seriously examine.
Well, Zelensky said, yes, Little Zelensky, the comedian, said he'd like to meet with Xi of China. Of course he would, because a man of his ego will only talk to the head guy, obviously.
Yeah.
A diplomat's not good enough for him.
Well, the Germans are obviously interested in doing business with the Chinese, but I think Scholz is effectively intimidated. He's afraid. He doesn't want to contradict anybody in Washington. Look, this is the man who's head of his country, effectively, and is yet to raise the issue of the Nord Stream 2. I mean, you would think that he would have stood up and said, wait a minute, we've been allies for decades. We like the United States. We've supported the United States. Why did you do this?
We know the U.S. blew up Nord Stream 2.
Well, I think the evidence is pretty substantial. I think Cy Hirsch has done a good job. He may not have all the details right in terms of what was technically done. Who knows?
I remember when it happened, I said, why would the Russians blow up their own pipeline? It just didn't make sense. You own a gas station in town and you blow up the gas line coming into your gas station. No, you don't. I mean, sometimes you have to reduce it to a little small microcosm to understand an issue. Of course, Russia wouldn't blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, which is what Jake Sullivan said they did.
And then you have President Biden, who warned everybody that we would do it. And when they said how, he said, don't worry, we'll do it.
How did they do it?
And then Nuland stands up and says, we will do it.
How did they do it?
Well, you got to, if you read Cy Hirsch's article, he talks about the use of underwater experts in the Navy. In other words, deep sea divers who went down there and planted charges, and it was done under the cover of an exercise.
Oh, boy.
That may be true. I have no idea.
Of course.
But I do know that technically we're well positioned to do those kinds of things.
But what was the point? To cut off revenue to Russia? Was that the short-term goal?
I think it was twofold. It was, first of all, to cut off revenue to Russia, of course, which was stupid because they made it up very easily.
Yes.
But secondly, it was also to put the Germans on notice. You know, you've been doing business with the Russians, and we have never really approved of this. We don't like it, and you're going to get back in line and do what we tell you to do. Oh,
my God. Are they burning their grandmother's mahogany furniture yet, or what are they doing for an alternate energy source?
Well, they haven't had that bad a winter, frankly. I mean, it's been bad, but not as bad as it could have been, and that may change next year. But the bottom line is I think Germans are beginning to say, why are we in this alliance? So
we're at a junction now. You know, you've been on this podcast several times, and you rationally said that the invasion would occur with the 250,000 or so Russian troops ready to attack north and west, that it would occur once the ground froze over. The ground has frozen over, and they're not. No?
Unfortunately, in southern Ukraine, we had some areas that are frozen and some that aren't. So even the Ukrainians that have tried to launch some counterattacks were restricted to the roads, because if you drive any armored fighting vehicle, truck, or track, doesn't matter, off the road, you sink down in 10 or 15 feet of black earth.
Oh, my God.
And this black earth was so good. I mean, it's so fruitful.
Yes.
A friend of mine told me, Doug, you could stick a stick in it, and within a few days, a tree comes out. I mean, he was exaggerating, but he was telling the truth. And people don't know this, but during World War II, when the Germans obviously conquered all of Ukraine and were in Russia, Hitler had trainloads of this black earth sent back to Germany.
Oh, my God.
It's that good.
What is the geological origin of this soil?
I don't know. You got to get a geologist.
I'd like to look into it, because it can't be volcanic.
All I know is that it is extremely fertile.
Probably a peat. I would guess it's a peat over eons of peat development, which is extremely fertile. This is astounding. Of course, we all knew that Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. Everyone's known that forever. And we talked about that. And I went to buy laundry detergent today. The price is double, as I knew it would be, because all petroleum-based products are doubling and tripling in price. I'm watching the little supermarket things.
Sure.
And you could see it in just plain old laundry detergent, which is a derivation of a petroleum byproduct. What's going on? I am hopeful intuitively that once China stepped up with a peace plan, no matter what the warmongers and the machine of war is officially saying, I think there's a lot of second thinking going on, Colonel, that they better back off from their militancy, because this could get out of hand. What do you think that's possible?
I wish I could find evidence for it, but I just don't.
I understand there's no evidence for it. It's a pure leap of faith that the world will come to its senses before it is too late. And that leads us to the last question of the day. As a military man, my worst fear is not that Russia invades on two fronts, but that something worse happens and that we make the mistake of bombing some emplacements in Russia. We, the U.S. or NATO. We did it in Serbia. We repainted United States warplanes, as everyone well knows, with NATO markings, and our bombers bombed Serbia. They bombed every bridge on the Danube River, which had not happened ever in history, by the way. The Serbs looked up and said, wait a minute. The last time we saw planes flying over Belgrade was when the Nazis were bombing us. They were heartbroken because they were great allies of America during World War II. They couldn't believe what we were doing to them. They weren't fooled by the NATO markings. I fear that this government could take United States weaponry, repaint it with NATO markings, and start bombing into Russia. You think that's a crazy possibility?
Doctor, I don't know. I really don't know. But what I can tell you is that I saw a German general with tears in his eyes when we bombed Belgrade.
At the time?
Yes, because he said all of us supported NATO because we believed that NATO's mission was to prevent another war in Europe from ever breaking out. And he said, here we are waging war against another European nation. The Germans overwhelmingly were uncomfortable with that. All the German officers disliked it intensely.